About 2 years ago, I started a new job at a fine dining restaurant. About 3 weeks after working there, I was going to my car after my shift, and I ran into one of my new coworkers in the parking lot. She was standing in her undershirt smoking a cigarette. She said hi, and she started to walk towards me, so I stopped to see what she wanted. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. She began to tell me all about why she had moved here, about her married boyfriend who wouldn't stop sleeping with his wife, about their trip to Big Bear, and how that ended their relationship, and about her struggles to get him to use a condom because she had genital warts as a result of HPV. Then she stopped and looked at me, a clear regulator. It was now my turn to say something, and without a chance to consider my response, I blurted out, "HPV gave me cervical cancer," which at the time was something that I had only told maybe 10 people. I felt immediate regret over my own self-disclosure. Self-disclosure is the process of deliberately revealing information about oneself that would not normally be known by others, and that is significant. It is driven by multiple motives, affected by many situations, and regulates conversations through expectations of feedback. Every single person experiences self-disclosure every day, whether giving or receiving in various degrees. In fact, it is stated in the British Journal of Social Psychology in 2005 that in appropriate circumstances, it was healthier to reveal feelings and other personal matters than to suppress them. Disclosing oneself was a positive and desirable thing to do. Today, first, we're going to examine the communication concepts associated with self-disclosure. Second, we will determine the motives and risks involved. Third, we are going to learn appropriate and expected feedback. And finally, we will analyze the self-disclosure processes in the popular 80s film The Breakfast Club. But before we can come to any conclusions, we must first find out how self-disclosure is defined and measured. Self-disclosure can be verbal or written. It can be facts about oneself, opinions or attitudes, or information about moods and emotions. In a disclosure decision model determining how and when individuals will self-disclose, published in 2000, Julia Marzu describes the ways that self-disclosure is measured. Breadth refers to the number of topics covered in a self-disclosure. Duration is the amount or persistence measured by word count or time spent. Depth is the intimacy level. Subject is considered intimate if it is emotionally intense or may be perceived as negative or embarrassing. Berg and Archer state in Disclosure or Concern, a second look at liking for the normbreaker, published in 1980, that descriptive intimacy refers to the revelation of private facts about oneself, whereas evaluative intimacy, on the other hand, involves the conveying of judgment and effect. Positive self-disclosure is described by Cortelli and Newman in an interpersonal analysis of self-disclosure and feedback in 1978 as telling another person about one's positive traits, and negative self-disclosure is sharing negative evaluations of oneself. Self-disclosure is situational. Julia Marzu writes that self-disclosure must be to another person, therefore diary would be considered self-expression. And according to Antaki, Barnes, and Ludart in the article Self-Disclosure as a Situational Interactional Practice in the British Journal of Psychology in 2005, telling a stranger that you are pregnant would be considered high intimate self-disclosure. However, telling a nurse the same thing would just be expected. The British Journal of Psychology continues, the phrase, "I hate snow," might be a rejection of an invitation to take a walk in a winter landscape or a sniffy disapproval of the winter scene in a painting, and so on. Now that we know what constitutes self-disclosure, we should look at why people would choose to self-disclose and the risks that are involved. Adler and Proctor in Looking Out, Looking In, published in 2010, so that there are certain goals of self-disclosure. They can be also combined or overlapping. Approval is the default goal. People generally want to be liked, so we disclose facts about ourselves that portray us in a favorable light. Intimacy can be achieved by telling others about our personal feelings, thoughts, and secrets, and relief of stress. According to Ryan Carmen and Fitzgerald in the article, The Recipient of Self-Disclosure in the Journal of Psychology in 1981, self-disclosure is not only a relatively stable personality attribute, but also a trait likely to be associated with good psychological adjustment and mental health. And identity clarification. According to Adler and Proctor, talking it out can be helpful. This can happen with therapists, friends, hairdressers, and bartenders. Sometimes it's easier to talk to people we don't know very well. There are also risks involved with self-disclosure. The higher the risk, the less likely someone will be to self-disclose. Julia Marzu describes these risks as follows. Social rejection would be for somebody to disclose something about themselves that could cause a group to reject them. So maybe if you wanted to join a team or a club, you wouldn't want to tell anyone that you hated the captain or the president. Betrayal would be if the listener took that information and shared it with someone else or used it against the person. And causing discomfort for the listener. Obviously, if you told your wife that you do think she looks fat in that dress, she would be uncomfortable. So now that we've discussed how self-disclosure is defined and measured, the reasons we may choose to disclose or not to, let's look at appropriate and expected feedback. In Development of Reciprocity of Self-Disclosure, published in the Journal of Genetic Psychology in 1992, Rosenberg and Chase found that by the 4th grade, children were already beginning to understand that equal intimacy was expected during feedback. And in an interpersonal analysis of self-disclosure and feedback published in Social Behavior and Personality, an International Journal in 1978, Fratelli and Newman found that the intimacy level in feedback is usually higher than the initial disclosure, and positive feedback is usually higher than negative feedback. This ties in with observable social norms. Now that we know how self-disclosure is defined and measured, the goals and risks, and expected and appropriate feedback, let's see how this information converges in the movie The Breakfast Club. Throughout the whole movie, the characters are constantly dealing with self-disclosure. In the beginning, they don't know each other, so they're judging based on their stereotypes. Therefore, the risks of self-disclosure are too high, of betrayal and rejection. So they limit their self-disclosures to limited durations of low-depth descriptive intimacies so as not to jeopardize their current level of approval. An example would be when Brian says, "I'm in the math club, I'm in the physics club too," or when Allison says, "My home life is unsatisfying." As the film progresses, the depth and duration increase as well as positive feedback. An example would be when Brian says, "Excuse me for being a virgin, I'm sorry." Claire responds with positive feedback by saying, "I think it's okay for a guy to be a virgin." Or after Andrew explains the pressure brought on by his father to win constantly, he says, "I really hate him. He's like this mindless machine I can't even relate to anymore." Bender responds with positive feedback by saying, "I think your old man and my old man should get together and go bowling." By the end of the movie, every character has revealed both high depths of descriptive and evaluative intimacies and positive and negative feedback. By doing this, they have achieved the goals of self-disclosure. The first being approval. Approval is achieved at the end of the film when Brian says, "I consider us all friends, am I wrong?" And the response from the group is no. Intimacy is achieved by telling each other their personal feelings, thoughts, and secrets. And relief of stress and identity clarification are achieved with the feelings of solidarity attained. The kids no longer feel alone, but realize that they all struggle with parents, peer pressure, authority figures, and stereotypes. So today we have discussed how to define and measure self-disclosure, the motives and risks that are involved, expected and appropriate feedback, and finally we related all this information to an applicable pop culture film. The conversation I had with my coworker has haunted me ever since. I just couldn't get past the fact that I had told a near stranger something that I hadn't even told some of my really close friends. After doing much research on the subject, I came to the conclusion that I'm a product of my environment and that society has raised me to match her intimacy level, and maybe it's good for my mental health. I still regret that conversation, but it no longer haunts me.